So when it comes to like the blockchain world, we have seemed to be in a very like similar skeuomorphic stage, right? Where people look at NFTs and they're like, oh, I guess it's something like you can buy or sell. So well, maybe an NFT is like a painting. Um, and then that is not totally getting it. So then people come along and they're like, well, maybe an NFT is like more like a membership pass to like a country club, like the Bored Ape Yacht Club.
I guess the problem I've been mulling over my head is why the metaverse, right? You know, I have a Meta Quest 2 and I barely use it because like, you know, it's fun like when you're doing it, but after it's like, I could have like not done it and not cared, right? All right. Welcome everyone to another episode of the Medallion XLN podcast, episode 3. Today I'm here with a special guest, the C from the Lootverse, and he's going to talk to us about emergent art. So tell
Well,
me more
first, it
about
might
emergent
be
art.
useful to introduce myself a little bit more, and then we can dive into emergent art. Um, so,
For
I
sure.
slash we are the C. We like to think of myself as a coalition of identities, of kind of many faces and names. So, those identities right now are kind of swimming in a primordial soup. I haven't really figured out how to kind of differentiate them yet. But for the purposes of this conversation, I am channeling the spirit of ISC, and I am using the voice of Glossoc. So yeah, I had to establish that first. Yeah. Hmm.
So, so to be clear, when you say you are many identities, like what does that mean? Is there multiple people in a group, or are you just one person with split
No,
personality disorder?
a single person, obviously, but I like to imagine the kind of identity of the artist, I guess, in the kind of space that I work in, that being the Lootverse, and in kind of like the current, era of the internet and stuff as being this kind of combination of identities, right? Because you have one name and face in the Discord group that you work in. You have another name and face in, the life that you live with your family off of the internet. And then in the metaverse, or the hyperverse, however you want to call it, you know, you're going to be using so many different avatars and visualizations of what you look like, and probably a whole lot of other names, and then also a whole lot of other voices. So I think that there's something very interesting in this conception of the self as a kind of community of identities. So that's something I'm kind of exploring in the story of, I guess, us, the artist, if that makes sense.
That does make sense. And I want to go deeper into it. So, pretty much what you're saying is that we exist as different aspects of ourselves depending on what interface we expose ourselves to. So, for example, in Discord, you're one person, in real life, you're another person, and the metaverse and the various avatars that you assume you'll be
Yeah,
different
it's
people.
like
Is that
I
correct?
feel like the next iteration of the internet, and I don't want to speak in absolutes, even though I guess sometimes my words sound like I'm speaking in absolutes. There's obviously always more going on, and I also don't want to claim that this is how everything is. I think there's something very problematic about that. But I do think there is this general shift towards, I guess, yourself as more of a we than a solitary I. I mean, when you just also think about like the identity of the artist, it feels like for the last many decades, like the artist has been defined as a celebrity, right? Like if you want to make it in the world, you have to role play as a single self, right? With your the face of your physical body and your government name, your given name by your parents, and uh, if you kind of want to build out uh, a story around yourself, uh, it's going to be under that identity. And I feel like we're entering a world on the internet where it's changing from that celebrity artist to this more like community artist thing. So that's like one kind of angle of that idea. I think it runs deep in other different ways, and it's again, I'm in the earliest stages of it. So uh, yeah, it's soupy right now.
No, I understand. So what I want to expand more on is this idea of a celebrity, because from my perspective, like a celebrity seems to be like this idol that everyone kind of freeze frames this person into their favorite part. Like, for example, Will Smith, everyone loves him from The Fresh Prince and the various movies that he's done. But with the recent incident, people are like shocked because they're like, how could The
Yeah.
Fresh Prince slap Chris Rock, right? Because that's so the roles that he's played that we don't really seem to understand that he's a human, and he goes through these various emotions and goes through these various growths, and where he was probably like 5 years ago, he's in a completely different place now. But we still have this freeze frame of him from like the Fresh Prince in 1996, which
Freeze
is
frame is
which
a
has always been very
beautiful,
interesting
beautiful
to
way of
me.
putting it too.
So, as these avatars become more popular, and we're seeing the rise of the Board Ape Yacht Club and these various avatars that are being used as profile pictures to represent that I'm part of this elite club. I am curious how the celebrity effect and this freeze frame is going to take place in society, and how that's going to affect the growth
Yeah,
of society and
totally.
civilization as a
I,
whole.
the way I like
Any
to
thoughts
think
on
about
that?
it is that we've been kind of in this like era of our mythology that I would call the theater of celebrity, where, unlike maybe previous um, societies that worshipped and prayed to and told stories about quote unquote metaphorical characters like Zeus or Hades or Jesus, right, or Pan, that it seems that in the era of celebrity, they have kind of taken that position in our culture, which I think at its origin, in the 60s or whatever, with Andy Warhol's work, was really, really interesting and of like religious merit in a way. But we have reached this like state of like super abundance of celebrity, right? Where everybody is on their own stage with their own kind of crowd of followers that they're kind of interacting with. And it's in this big kind of like Marvel Cinematic Universe of celebrity avatars that kind of is built off of all of these crossovers, you know, with Pete Davidson showing up in the Kim Kardashian story, or, you know, Chris Rock showing up in the Will Smith story. And uh, I think that that particular era may be starting to transition or fade a bit. And it seems that this kind of other thing that is various called the hyperverse, the metaverse, is doing something almost totally different. Because now, actually, I'll stop it there. Yeah.
Well, I want to expand more on the mythical characters that you brought up a little bit earlier, like Zeus and these Greek gods, and how these characters were used as like heroes to kind of tell stories on morality and teach different lessons, and how that is kind of continued today with comic book characters and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and Thor and Batman and all these different things. Because personally, I don't relate to Zeus or Hercules at all, but I relate to Batman and the Green Lantern and Superman, and I can see, I can understand their sense of morality, as opposed if you told me a story about like Odysseus
Yeah.
and the Odyssey and the Iliad and Odyssey, right? So transitioning that to how that's going to shape the metaverse, and how people can embody these different avatars and become pretty much whoever they want, just like in some of these cartoons from the 90s, like I
I'm
think
not, no.
Reboot. Are you familiar with
Yeah.
Reboot? Have you ever seen that cartoon? Okay, so it was pretty much a cartoon from the 90s. It was 3D, where like you went into this computer world, and they had like the whole lives that they were living, and it was pretty interesting. And obviously, like, they have access to like lightning fast motorcycles that it could just summon at a thought, right? And just living in a world like that, it seems like that's where the future is headed. And I wonder how that's going to affect our morality and our appreciation of
Yeah, definitely.
things that we take for granted.
I also think that, at least in something like the Lootverse, the stories we tell, like, they seem to be real in a way that, you know, like a book or a TV show feels more fictional, at least to like the kind of general audience in Loot. I mean, like, one way you could think about it is that, like, uh, I think one of the reasons that celebrity has been so culturally dominant is because, like, we see it as being real. You know, it's like, a story about Odysseus, or a myth about Zeus, or a TV show about Luke Skywalker. They might tell like a metaphorical truth, but it's not like a literal truth, because it didn't literally happen here on planet Earth, right? But at least when it comes to the stories we're telling in the Lootverse and the broader metaverse, it seems to me that the more you kind of like enter this digitally native world, right? The events that happen as you role play as a variety of different characters um, inside, the universe of new mythologies, they start to feel more and more literally real. And I think that there's a weird thing happening with like what's real and what's not real, that's possibly at the core of this whole, very, very kind of early, you know, PFP avatar and visualization of the self that is not, your government name and physical body. Yeah. You could even imagine in the metaverse, like, I could be, uh, using my Kanye voice while
Mm-hmm.
like wearing my Loot for Adventurers bag while acting in a Loot for Adventurers game, right? While visualized with like a different body, it's almost like you're dressing up the self with all of these different identities. And that's where that whole notion of a we or a community artist comes into play, I think.
All
Mm-hmm.
right, let's get back to that in a bit. Before, I feel like we're getting so, like we started off so metaphysical. I think people watching this are just lost right now. Like, what are they
Sure.
talking about? So let's
Loot.
ground
Yeah.
it and bring it back to the loot
Um,
and what's the role
a
that you played in
variety of
loot
things.
first?
So, Gloss OC and I started making music, and for different kind of characters in the Lootverse, and writing some fan fiction, so to speak. And then throughout that time, on my own time, and now particularly, I've been trying to develop kind of a shared conceptual understanding of like, what the Lootverse is, and uh, how we can talk about it like clearly, because it's something very different and strange.
How
Well,
how is it different and strange?
it's kind of a big question, but loot. Well, maybe it's useful to kind of talk about the story of loot, but um, it loot seemed to be one of the first projects that unlocked something with art on the blockchain that previous projects hadn't quite figured out. And so in August back in 2021, for those that aren't familiar, Dom Hoffman posted these things on the blockchain called, here, let me pull them up, um, uh, called loot bags. They look like this. And they kind of were totally different than a lot of previous um, like NFT projects, because instead of featuring some kind of little JPEG or avatar character, they just had these like long lists of items, like long sword, robe of enlightenment, or chain boots of detection. And the items seem to suggest that there was a broader universe that they came from, but that universe didn't yet exist. All the people were confronted with were these various items. And kind of from that initial kind of drop, this enormous kind of community of projects like started to launch. And so, a certain group came along and looked at the items and said, well, what if there were land for these items? And the Realms Biblioteca project propped up. And then another project came along and thought, what is the currency for these items? And the Adventure Gold project propped up. And then another project comes along and says, well, who carried these items? And a bunch of like various characters popped up. And kind of slowly but surely, this like whole expanded universe has kind of emerged, all trying to like build the world that these items apparently came from. So that's kind of how the Loot project has continued to grow. And this thing that's been growing has been very baffling to people and kind of difficult to wrap our heads around, because it seems to be doing some things that we definitely haven't encountered for art in Web3, and some things that maybe we haven't encountered in any previous art form throughout history. So
Are there multiple, like how many NFTs are in the initial loot drop?
8,000. Yeah.
8,000?
Yes.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So do these, are these projects, is the initial drop of the NFTs, is that like is that the Bible for all these projects to go out off of? Or like how much freedom is there to interpret what these lists mean?
Um, Absolute freedom to decide what these lists of bags mean. Yeah. Um, so, for example, the Bible is a really good, actually, example because it has kind of like, the canonical truths of the mythology of Christianity, right? But a lot of different people have different conceptions of like what the Bible means and what world you should build based on its truths, right? So, like Christianity forks into like Catholicism with one interpretation of the Bible, and the Anglican Church another interpretation of the Bible, and Baptist Church, and all of these different kind of forking paths of interpretations. And the Lootverse is very, very similar. So, some projects come along and see that these items seem to imply that it's kind of like a fantasy, an RPG type universe, very much like the ones that people are familiar with in video games and fantasy worlds like Lord of the Rings or whatever. But there's nothing stopping another project coming along and deciding that there seems to be a different cosmic truth within the loot bags, and perhaps imagining like an alien universe that has nothing to do with like human beings whatsoever, and they're totally free to just derive that vision of that universe and start their own series of loot projects and their own communities of loot projects. So, yeah.
So this greatness score, could you explain that to me?
Yeah, so this is the, I guess, interesting thing about what happened when these items launched, because they seem to kind of imply a different relationship with all of these different items. Because at first it just looked like a bunch of things that fantasy characters would wear, right? A silk robe and an ancient helm or whatever. But as the kind of months passed after these NFTs dropped, people started to kind of like pull them apart, right? They kind of looked into the earlier parts of a phrase, like a tempest shout, and they realized that that was like a prefix, and suggested some kind of little hidden detail within the contract. And they kind of looked into the contract, and they realized that each of these items had like a certain greatness score, meaning kind of like a level of like power. Some items were more powerful and some items were less powerful. And then they also kind of looked into this contract, and they realized that some of the items had different like orders. So there's an order of power, an order of giants, and an order of titans, and an order of skill. So there's kind of like within inside these contracts like an entire vision of the loot universe, that you kind of get closer and closer the more you kind of dig into all the little details hidden inside the contract. That has been a kind of journey that people have been doing for months and months and months. Yeah.
That's interesting because I am Medallion XLN. We're working on our own metaverse, and I'm doing a lot of thinking on how our metaverse will be different from whatever the current offerings are. And a lot of that involves like the avatar, like a user's identity, and then like what can the user do with this avatar? Because yes, he's interacting in this virtual world, but I what I guess the problem I've been mulling over my head is why the metaverse, right? Because we have mobile apps, those are fun. We have video game consoles, those are fun. We have like computer games, those are fun. And none of them require me to actually tap in and go into the metaverse. And when you put on the VR headset, after a while you start to get a little dizzy and disoriented. And I have a Meta Quest 2, and I barely use it because it's fun like when you're doing it, but after it's like, I could have like not done it and not cared, right? So I'm trying to figure out like what's the reason for for people to go into the metaverse? Is it going to be a social thing? Is it going to be a collaboration thing? That's the missing link. That's why the metaverse hasn't taken off yet, because there's something missing, and it's really hard to pinpoint exactly what that is right now because the technology is so new.
Yeah. Yeah, it's also like a very unclear word too. Like, does metaverse mean like just like a bunch of virtual realities? Or does it mean like, is like the internet part of the metaverse? Like, is this call part of the metaverse? It seems to be a very kind of fuzzy concept, as it's kind of understood in popular consciousness for now. Um, so, yeah.
Well, I think that's kind of one of the beauties of the metaverse, because just like the Lootverse, like you just have these words and then you have to define what these words mean. So the metaverse, this is like a brand new buzzword. Like, it's been around for a while, but it's now actually like in mainstream consciousness. And now we have like a bunch of creators trying to figure out like what exactly is the metaverse. And we see the looming threat of Mark Zuckerberg and Meta, and they want to completely own the metaverse. And we're like, what can we do as individuals to, not be slaves to whatever Meta's vision is for the metaverse? Like, we want a free and open metaverse, and not something that we have to pay. We have to pay like what's those fees that you have to pay in video games? I forgot, like loot boxes or something like that.
Like a,
Yeah,
yeah.
but you guys know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about.
definitely.
But yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, the kind of question of like the broader metaverse and the politics of um, Facebook and all of that, I think is, you know, not particularly my domain. But I do think that the kind of loot universe at least kind of shows one element of how people can exist and make art inside this kind of these open worlds. So, yeah.
For sure. So let's talk more about art and a definition of art, because what you are focused on is emergent art. Can you explain more what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So uh, it might be kind of useful to give a little bit of background. I mean, um, you know, so for example, I'll give a little story of like movies, right? So when the kind of first movie camera were invented, it was pretty clear that this technology could be used to make art. Um, and the first kind of years where people were making art with these cameras were kind of crappy because it takes like a really, really long time, when you have a new technology to find something that technology does that is like totally unique. So the first movies, like they borrow from previous art forms, right? It's like a bunch of people standing in front of a camera and like posing for a picture because they're like, well, I guess it's kind of like a photo. or it's like basically somebody just like plopping in camera in front of a stage and people like acting out a play because they're like, I guess it's like a theater piece. And it takes a really, really long time for filmmakers to discover like the art form of narrative film. So there's actually a technical word for that. That's called like the skeuomorphic phase. And it's something you encounter when people start making art with a new technology. So when it comes to like the blockchain world, we have seemed to be in a very like similar skeuomorphic stage, right? Where people look at NFTs and they're like, oh, I guess it's something like you can buy or sell. So well, maybe an NFT is like a painting. Um, and then that is not totally getting it. So then people come along and they're like, well, maybe an NFT is like more like a membership pass to like a country club, like the Bored Ape Yacht Club, and so on and so forth. So, this has kind of happened for a really long time until the Loot project dropped. And Loot seemed to kind of like unlock something in terms of like making art on the blockchain that we haven't really discovered before. So, in its broadest sense, like emergent art is this kind of like growing understanding of like what the art form is that Loot has unlocked, basically.
Okay. So do you think that emergent art is restricted to Loot, or can it be done outside of Loot?
Yeah, it can definitely be done outside of Loot. I think Loot is like the best first example of that project and of that art form, but it's not totally restricted to Loot whatsoever. Yeah. So yeah.
Right. Well, I want to get a lot deeper into like, so what separates emergent art from regular art, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically, for the last year that Loot has been out, people have been, the community in Loot, have been trying to answer that question because it seemed to be doing something different. So folks have kind of given it like a lot of different names. Like people called it collaborative world building. They called it collaborative media. They called it bottom up art. They called it DAO art. They called it decentralized storytelling. There's about like a list of 12 different names for what Loot was. And basically like the picture that we got from that was that Loot is this kind of like decentralized network of artworks built by this community where anybody can come in and, add a little project to this growing world, right? So like somebody can come in and build Loot paintings, and another person can come in and build music for Loot, and another person can come and build in video games for Loot. And it seems to be this like one massive work of art that combines all the art forms, through the power of this big decentralized community. And that seemed to be kind of getting at the picture. But over the last couple months, we have started to really try to zero in on what it is that makes Loot different. And it seems to be that there's a certain practice in Loot of building these things that people call primitives, that from which you can start to understand where Loot is this other thing. So, yeah.
So it's like I guess compiling or building primitives up on top of each other. So, for example, my last podcast was with Banners,
Yeah.
right? And they built primitives for like what a world or what a realm in the Lootverse would be. So, for example, they got one for us with owl, bludgeon, and staff, and we were supposed to use like those words to figure out like what our world building is going to be. And we came up with something like, the owl is wisdom, so the ancient god from Egypt, thought, right? He was usually represented as some sort of avian, and he's like the god of wisdom. So, our world building or storytelling was about like thought, creating, this guild that uses magic, which is the staff, and but they are also like kind of barbarians, so they use like clubs to bludgeon like their enemies to death, right? So that was our world building project, and it all started from the primitive that they set above us, and then someone else can come along and say, all right, we like thought and we like staffs and magic and warriors. So now we're gonna create like a whole new, or we're gonna flesh out each aspect of those primitives and just build on top of what we've already built on. Is that a correct assessment?
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I mean, so the reason that some things that we're saying here and when it comes to loot seem to be probably like very coherent, and other things that we talk about loot seem to be like totally alien and hard to wrap your head around, is because it's very very difficult to have to have a way to explain an art form or a process in art that is completely new. I mean, imagine trying to explain what a movie was to somebody before they'd even heard of like a movie camera. You'd be like, it's like a picture, but it like moves and then it cuts to another picture, and there's also sound, and it's kind of like oral storytelling. Like it, the only way you could be to totally wrap your head around this thing is by actually like watching a movie. So within the whole Lootverse, the thing that is kind of most strange and mysterious and difficult for us to talk about and wrap our head around is this idea of the primitive, the one you just explained. So I have some slides that I use to talk about this, but the idea of a primitive is like something that's not totally new, at least inside other disciplines. Like philosophy has the concept of primitive notions, and math has primitive functions, like linguistics has like word roots. And basically, like in each of those contexts, the idea is that a primitive is like kind of like the very basic and first like elements from which a bunch of other stuff like emerges. So, for example, in linguistics, the concept of a primitive is that like, from what I understand, it's the root word from which a bunch of other words kind of are derived. Or in philosophy, like a primitive notion is like the very, very basic assumptions that you have to make for that, the rest of your kind of argument to grow. So in the context of like loot, like, the way we like think about these primitives, at least for now, and it's one of those words that is used correctly and incorrectly, is it's like kind of this practice of paring something down to its like original and most basic elements for other artworks like to emerge from. So like you could think of as like a thought experiment, like the primitives of like the Big Bang being that original elements, whatever they were, like helium, hydrogen, and matter or antimatter. And in that sense, too, like the primitives of the Lootverse are, these like original 8,000 or thousands of items inside these loot bags. So once people kind of come upon these primitives, that's where, this kind of magical process happens, where they look into these original elements and start to kind of derive their own artworks, the same way that you interacted with like the banners works and kind of developed your own vision of what it all meant.
That's very interesting because, if we break it down, like I think everything can derive from the world that we live in, right? Because I guess in order to get to the metaverse, first had to be an artist who sat down and sketched the world around him, right? And then that created a picture, and then then a whole renaissance of pictures happened, and then people are like, how can we create these pictures without having an artist actually draw it? And that led to the photograph, and then a whole renaissance of photographic developments happened, and then that led to the video camera. Now we can have photographs or stills that move one after another, and then that created a whole revolution in the movie industry. And now I feel like that has all led up to the metaverse. And now I think after movies led up to video games, where we got to interact with these virtual worlds. And now that's led up to the metaverse, where we're going to be actually inside of these virtual worlds and could probably even live our entire lives in these virtual worlds. So that just illustrates how powerful a primitive can be.
Yeah, and basically, the artistic practice of building a primitive is like trying to assemble a bunch of like original elements so that it can give somebody like a vision of what they can build with those original elements. So, like, for example, if I wanted to start like the Star Wars universe totally anew, you can imagine like Star Wars never existed, but I wanted to like seed the Star Wars universe with like a set of primitives. I could basically, instead of making, this movie, I could imagine the Star Wars universe as having a bunch of kind of like loot type items, right? Like where it could be like the lightsaber, the Jedi lightsaber of the light, and the Sith lightsaber of the First Order, or a stormtrooper helmet of the Imperial squadron. And it would be in that process of people kind of coming to them and kind of pulling them apart, that they would have their own vision of like where these items from the Star Wars universe originated. So there are like a few artists kind of like pioneering this practice, but it's still obviously very early. So yeah.
So what I really like about the Lootverse is its emphasis on decentralization and collaboration. And if you think about the history of the internet, like that's pretty much what makes the internet revolutionary. Like the ability to collaborate with someone like halfway across the earth, right? And for us to, link our ideas together to create like space, right? Because if we think about like huge companies like Facebook, like if we break that down, Facebook is just a blogging site. But the only thing that made Facebook revolutionary is that they added a shared component where multiple people can come together and share their thoughts and comment on each other's thoughts, and create this kind of community. So I believe that Lootverse is creating like a community, right? That each contributor can build upon what the previous contributor has set before. So I think that's the revolutionary idea, and that's the revolutionary concept, right?
Yeah, I think you're totally hitting at that too. Basically, like you can think of the Lootverse as this like this kind of large democracy that includes this big community and a bunch of works of art that are built by that community. And the kind of art of working in the Lootverse is not just like making these artworks, but deciding like how this community is going to organize itself and govern itself. But the kind of most powerful thing about working in a space like that is that every single person is like their own boss, where you can like have your cake and eat it too, basically. Where like I can start my own loot projects that I decide, the exactly what I want for my creative vision. But at the same time, I'm in this community of like architects and developers and mathematicians and painters and filmmakers and generative artists that can build off of my projects and that I can kind of collaborate with too. And it's an incredibly like rich and thriving like place to make art. And I think that the more there are more of those spaces on the internet, I think that that's where a lot of people will start to kind of enter the so-called metaverse. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I really think the future of the metaverse is based on collaboration. If we can, because I've never played Minecraft, but from what I understand about Minecraft is uh, it's a world that you kind of build stuff in. Is that
Yep.
correct? You kind of build things, and then other people can come along and build things on top of your
Yeah.
thing. Is that a good?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the metaverse is heading towards Minecraft, and once we can figure out how to kind of have all these amazing ideas come together and in this one kind of world that we can go to different realms, so to speak. Because, like, I think what's really going to define the metaverse is how friendly it is to businesses. Because if we are looking long term, right, the the metaverse is going to be a world where you can pretty much, it's like a playground. It's a playground of pretty much your wildest fantasies, right? So if you're a big Dragon Ball Z fan, someone can come along and program a physics system that allows you to fly and shoot lasers out your hands and do all types of amazing things. And it'll be just like you are the character in that anime, right? So I think in a Dragon Ball Z world or Dragon Ball Z metaverse, like you should be able to go to McDonald's, right? You should be able to have a Coke, and I think, that's where a lot of the, I guess, funding is going to come from, because the advertising model is not going to go anywhere. It's going to just evolve to exist in whatever the new thing is. So instead of like the advertising model being used, to monetize our data, it's now going to be used to say, hey, we have a presence in this particular metaverse. What do you think about that thought?
Yeah. You're touching on a lot of interesting things. The thing I keep coming back to, which I think is the existential question for not just loot, not just this thing we call emergent art, but for everything you just talked about, is like the question of like how these spaces are run and governed. Because like at the very beginning of kind of a whatever quote unquote revolution in the arts or the way people make things, there's a lot of idealism and uh, that kind of optimism can be dangerous because you can kind of like blind yourself to the ways in which these systems can be captured and not function for the people that use them and govern them and work in them every single day. So the thing I'm most interested to see, and obviously I'm sure it'll be a range of things. I'm sure there will be things that are super centralized and very extractive and anarcho-capitalist or whatever. But I think the real kind of question is how exactly these spaces are governed every day. So that's what I'm interested in from what you were saying.
So speaking of governance, like there is a incentive system in the Lootverse, right? Because what I guess the end goal is for everyone to be able to sell their NFTs. And it's kind of like the real estate market, for example, right? So if we have like a new housing development, the first house that's being sold in that housing development is going to be super cheap because like that's the first house. But as we build more and more houses and sell more and more houses, then the value of that entire uh, lot of land begins to increase and increase because it's being worth more. So in that metaphor, like when one Lootverse project sells really well, then that incentivizes another Lootverse project to sell really well, and so on and so forth. So that kind of creates a built-in monetization model that allows users to, work on their passions as well as, have the funds available to live a life that doesn't require them to be on food stamps,
Yeah.
pretty much.
Hopefully, I actually think that's the thing that is the least figured out in the Lootverse, because there are a lot of new ideas about how kind of property can be governed. The Radical Exchange Foundation has a lot of really interesting ideas that are being implemented in various projects around not just different models for ownership of assets, but also different ways for communities to kind of organize themselves with stuff like soulbound tokens. But those are all kind of ideas that are in their very kind of early and experimental stage. So I think that's something that's going to kind of play out over the long term. And I'm also not an economist, so I hesitate to give some kind of grand statement about how the economic system of loot is functioning. But what I will say is that there's a lot to be figured out, and a lot of experiments that are actually working out and very interesting too. Loot just did a big kind of Gitcoin grants fundraising round for all of the different projects, and a bunch of friends of mine got some pretty significant funding to build their kind of artworks in loot, and that was very inspiring and interesting, but only one tiny little piece of the puzzle. So that'll develop.
Very interesting. Now, in the beginning, you were talking about Andy Warhol, and I kind of cut you off because I wanted to get some foundation in. But what were you saying about that?
Well, Andy Warhol seemed to have a really extraordinary sixth sense for celebrity and the ways in which people think and interact with, the kind of idols of his time and our time. And so I was kind of thinking of Warhol as this interesting figure, especially when it pertains to the work that we're doing now, as something that seems to be, kind of interesting in a contrast. So, yeah.
Yeah, I also like Keith Haring.
Yeah.
I hope I'm saying his name right. Yeah, I really like his stuff because, I feel like his stuff started really on the street and then somehow it just blew up to this massive mainstream movement to the point where it's on Sesame Street. And that's where I was first into Keith Haring's work. So it's interesting just how art evolves based on how it speaks to a person, right? Because Leonardo da Vinci's work, for example, the Mona Lisa, that's we knew about the Mona Lisa before we even knew how to talk, right? It's just so prevalent and it's everywhere, and every single cartoon you watch, there's a reference to the Mona Lisa, and just how it's survived throughout the generations, and just defined like beauty standards and all types of things. It's just very interesting, and it speaks really to the power of
Yeah,
artists.
totally. I think the other thing I like about Warhol so much is that he seems to really have an intuition about the kind of art forms that are kind of most relevant in a particular time and period, right? Like, once he did all the silk screening and paintings and kind of got a little tired of that, he moved into film, which was obviously so kind of important in that time. And then in his later career, he became this kind of like many tentacled beast with like a hand in all of these different artistic mediums. Like he started like like a TV show and like a magazine, and he was like branding his image with like all kind of like brand deals and partnerships. And it was basically like on this pursuit to get like the image and face of Andy Warhol in every like relevant medium imaginable. And that comes from like a practice of thinking very, very deeply about how a given artistic medium affects a culture in its time. And I think that artists like that are always interesting to think about when you have new artistic mediums arising that are affecting the culture in a totally different way. There's always so much to learn from studying them. Yeah.
Absolutely. So how would you define the art of our current time? Like what are the different what's the primitives that you would use to define the art of our current
Um,
time?
well, it seems that one kind of, again, it's such a big question, but one way of thinking about that is the idea of like immersiveness, where it seems that the artistic mediums that kind of dominate the culture and are most relevant in a culture are like the ones that are the most immersive. We seem to be kind of going in a trend in that direction. So, like, let's take pop music. Okay, the pop music used to be when it started becoming very very whatever relevant. Let's just take it like 50s or whatever. Used to be something like that is just basically totally based in like the song itself, right? So it was like this single artistic medium that people engaged with. And then you have like the advent of the pop musician, not just as like a musician that writes songs, but as like a character, a celebrity with a personal life and a story that you can follow in the newspapers. And that kind of seems to make pop music more immersive. But then, later on you have like MTV and the music video, and the music starts to have to become more and more and more like visual for people to be like extremely engaged with it. And then you have like the advent of social media, where now like the popular musician is this like um, has to have like a foot in every single, like Andy Warhol, every single artistic medium imaginable, right? Like they need to get their face on a billboard. They have to have a concert. They have not just the music videos, but they also have their Instagram feed, their TikTok feed, their Twitter feed. And it's like every possible kind of artistic medium is like this tentacle that has to like attach itself to this super enormous like beast, so that people can be like immersed in the world of this pop star. Like pop stars aren't really even like solely musicians. They're more like transmedia like directors or storytellers. So um, I think that the artistic mediums that are going to be very relevant, at least in the short term future, from what it seems to be, are going to be the ones that win the kind of like, I don't like phrasing it like a contest or something, but the kind of like immersion battle, so to speak. And that's where I think that this whole concept of loot or whatever kind of really comes into play, because it seems to be the most immersive. So, yeah. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah. Well, let me just take some time to digest what you just said. So when you say loot is the most immersive, it's because it's immersive on multiple
Hmm.
levels, correct? Like it's immersive on the primitive level, and then based on how you can contribute, that's it's immersive on that level as well, because multiple people could have various ways of contributing to something like Warhammer. Like that could be a realm, that could be a banner, that could be a mount, that could be a weapon, that could be a lot of things. And it just sparks your imagination, and based on where your imagination goes is how you could contribute. So that is what you mean when you say it's immersive. Is that a correct
Yeah, I
assessment?
think the thing you point out that's really great is that like built making art is itself super immersive. Like again, let's go back to the pop music because I think it's just such a great example to think about this. Like um, songs, you know, are no longer primarily this thing that you close your eyes and shut out everything in the world and listen to as like a 360 immersive experience. The kind of most popular way for people to engage with songs is like TikTok, which is like almost like the radio now. And what TikTok does is it like cuts down a song to its like catchiest and most kind of inciting of a vision clip, and it makes you kind of like have this moment of becoming the artist and like doing something with the song, like whether it's a dance or a creation of like a meme, or telling some kind of personal story about yourself. Like that's the way that it seems that the culture engages with music, which is like a really, really crazy thing. And if you think about it, like so many of those artistic mediums that are really, really dominant now are like that. It's like streaming is like that. TikTok is obviously like that. Concerts have that element. And the article I just read recently is that like a majority of people watch Netflix with subtitles on. And for Gen Zers, it's because they're scrolling through TikTok or Instagram while watching the TV show. Because live tweeting while watching a TV show is way more immersive than actually watching the TV show. Um, so the thing that Loot does is it has that element of this kind of many tentacled monster where every single art form ever is all within the Lootverse, but it adds that element where every single person is just as central kind of an artist as any other person. Like you own your own little share of what it means to make art and loot. And I think that element is what, kind of pushes loot and projects like that towards this kind of like peak immersion, so to speak.
Interesting point. And I want to touch on what you said about how people immerse themselves in TV shows, because I do the exact same thing. Like whenever I'm working, I put on like an anime and I just like binge watch it. But I want to be right. Like it's not that I'm watching the anime; it's just that like I'm immersed in whatever like the world is while I'm like doing
Yeah.
my work, right? And every once in a while, I look see what's going on, and then I go back. You know what I'm saying? Like I don't really like watch it. I just want to be
Yeah.
immersed in it. And that's why I never watch anime with that are uh, that are subbed. Like I hate subtitled anime because pay attention, and I hate paying attention. I don't want to pay attention to anything. I just want to like be around. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a but I mean like
but
the other thing that you notice too is like this whole kind of like all it's like again if we talk about immersion, right? Like what is more like immersive than like a collection of like separate like artistic mediums, well, an entire universe and storytelling universe in which all of those mediums reside. And like, you know, if you look through the space that Loot is in and all the kind of metaverse is in, you'll see that there are so many different universes. There are the hyperverse, there is the metaverse, there's the idea of the pluriverse, there is the Lootverse, there is the nounsverse, there is the Bored Ape Yacht Club verse, and that's where I think the kind of, I don't know what to call it, the kind of universification of like the internet cinematic universe starts to make more sense, because it seems that at least the kind of artistic mediums of the day, again, trending towards that total immersion.
Yeah. Very interesting. It's very interesting. So, before we leave, is there anything you would like to say, just to promote
Sure.
something or
Yeah,
whatever you
y'all
want to
can
do?
follow me on Twitter at the C, and there I'm going to be talking for, I think, years and years, and writing for years and years about this kind of art form that was spawned in Loot, and particularly this idea of primitives. I'd also like to say that um, I don't feel that I did a totally just job of explaining emergent art or primitives, partially because, it's kind of like we're still kind of standing too close to the elephant, right? Like that whole parable about like somebody kind of standing right in front of an elephant, and they don't see that it's an elephant. They're just like, oh, it's like, a sheet of gray. And I think it's going to take a long time with a lot of building these things for us to be able to step back and talk about this entire, Lootverse elephant, and emergent art elephant coherently. So if you're interested in the kind of, tip of this iceberg, you can follow me on Twitter or hop into the Loot Discord and kind of engage in this new way of making art, because I think that it's special. So yeah.
I definitely think that as well. And do you have any projects that you're working on,
Mm-hmm.
or any
Yeah, I have a
news to share?
a series of projects. One, the whole kind of creation of this community artist that we talked about at the beginning, and then I am a very junior developer, but learning how to code so that I can start to kind of plant the primitives that I have been working on for the last year and a bit. So, yeah, I see that part of me. She's focused on the kind of conceptual dimension of this stuff, and then my other selves are focused on building these artworks with their bare hands. So yeah.
So you really compartmentalize like your different identities, huh?
Mm-hmm.
It's
They're
interesting.
each different characters that are going to be, like expanding and forking in this big storytelling universe that is me, the sea. So yeah.
How do you keep track of all yourselves?
Uh, that's a good question. I'm not sure. Again, I'm very
You have
soupy now.
a
Yeah, you obviously, like, there needs to be a home base where you can return to, where you don't feel kind of lost in this like swarm of identities. And I think that that is always going to be essential for a person to stay sane and happy and healthy. But it's not particularly any different than somebody that loves role playing and playing oneself in Dungeons and Dragons, and another self in Fortnite, and another self in Minecraft, and another self with one group of friends, and another self with their family. It's selves that are emergent products of the communities that you intersect in. So I think there is a balance between the we and the I.
Yeah, I think we all do that. I think we all role play as different people based on whatever medium we're interacting with. I don't think we do it to the level that you do it, which is like you have like different names for your different selves and different assignments. It's pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, I'm excited to watch each of them uh, grow, and I'm excited for people to role play as them as well. Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for being on an episode of the Medallion XLN podcast. I really enjoyed our conversation, learned a lot about loot and the Lootverse and the metaphysics of it all. And, if you want to come back on when it's time to launch whatever NFT collection you got going
Thank
on,
you,
you're more than
Dwayne. I really
welcome.
appreciate it.